On a Friday afternoon in the summer of 1980, 56-year-old Zygmund Adamski walked out of his house and down a sunlit street to a neighborhood market less than 300 yards from his front door. 5 days later, the lifeless body of Mr. Adamski was found 20 miles away atop a large pile of coal, in a bizarre physical state, with no indication of how he got there. To this day, the circumstances of his disappearance and demise have baffled investigators and the public, leading some to speculate the ultimate cause was not of this earth. Born on the 17th of August 1923, Zygmunt Adamski left his native Poland in the wake of World War II to pursue life in the British Isles. An agreeable and unassuming man, known as Ziggy to his friends, Mr. Adamski married fellow Polish immigrant Leokadia Kowalska in 1951. By 1960, he had taken employment with the Lofthouse Colliery as a coal miner and moved with his wife to Tingley, a small community situated in West Yorkshire, just south of the city of Leeds. For the Adamskis, the following 2 decades were fairly typical of blue-collar life, though not without problems. Both suffered non-trivial medical conditions, Zygmunt from coronary artery disease and Leokadia from physical deterioration brought on by multiple sclerosis, which would eventually confine her to a wheelchair. In the weeks leading up to the fateful day in 1980, the Adamskis had taken company in the form of Zygmunt's cousins Laska Teodosia and her son, who were on a 2-month holiday from their home in Poland. On Friday, June 6th, Mr. Adamski and Ms. Teodosia spent the morning shopping in Leeds and by early afternoon had returned to the Adamski residence in Tingley to enjoy a meal of fish and chips as a family. Around 3:30 p.m., Zygmunt announced to his wife and cousin he had to run a quick errand, specifically to buy potatoes. He walked out his front door on Thornfield Crescent, cheerfully greeted a neighbor who was himself taking advantage of the pleasant weather to wash his car, and walked northeast to a corner market halfway down Dewsbury Road. According to his wife, he left with only a wristwatch and a wallet containing his driver's license and about 20 pounds in cash. He was wearing nothing out of the ordinary: trousers, shoes, a striped jacket, and a button-down shirt. 5 days later, on a rain-soaked Wednesday afternoon, a man named Trevor Parker arrived at his place of employment, the Tomlins Coal Yard, in the small town of Todmorden, and discovered the body of an adult man lying on top of a 10 to 15-foot high tip, or loose, uncompacted mound of anthracite coal, situated in a walled bunker on the southern end of the property. Thinking the man may be seriously injured or possibly inebriated, Mr. Parker telephoned for authorities. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived, crewed by Trevor Knight and Graham Baldwin. After a quick examination, it was determined the man was in fact deceased, and local police were immediately contacted to take charge of the matter. At approximately 4:10 p.m., police constables Malcolm Agley and Alan Godfrey arrived and climbed the wooden retaining wall behind the coal tip to inspect the body, taking stock of any observable details in an effort to determine if the as-yet unidentified Mr. Adamski had been victim of a murder. Constable Godfrey later described his initial impressions. Quote, "I will never forget the sight that confronted me. The look on his face in death was of fear and pain. The eyes were staring into the sky." Unquote. Despite the frightful and suggestive expression, the man's posture was rather relaxed, his arms folded across his abdomen. Constable Godfrey remarked the pose not unlike taking a nap on one's couch. This was only the first in a series of incongruities. The victim's hair had been cut short, almost into a crew cut, and appeared to have been done so in a sloppy, unprofessional manner. Despite the effort applied to his hair, he was not clean-shaven, having about a day's growth of whiskers on his face. Although Mr. Adamski was wearing a jacket, trousers, and shoes, just as he had been on the day of his disappearance, he was not wearing his button-down shirt, but instead a string vest, a type of undergarment popular in the middle decades of the 20th century, designed to be worn next to the skin and help an individual retain body heat. He appeared to have been dressed roughly, very possibly by a third party, a telltale sign of foul play. Upon closer examination, Constable Godfrey discovered a series of small blackened burns on the back of the man's head and a blistered elliptical wound situated on the nape of the neck, just below the base of the skull. Some form of ointment or unguent had been applied to the larger wound, which had also been described by P.C. Godfrey as weeping, though this could simply be due to an overabundance of said substance. Deciding the death was indeed suspicious, P.C. Agley called for a forensic team. At 4:25, Police Sergeant Nevison, Police Constable Birmingham, and Jack Parker, father of Trevor Parker and owner of the coal yard, arrived on scene. 11 minutes later, a police surgeon named Dr. Adshead arrived to perform an official examination of the body, as well as pronounce the unknown man dead, which was no doubt considered a formality at this point, as the fact was obvious to the growing number of observers on site. Like Constable Godfrey, Dr. Adshead gave particular attention to the wounds on Mr. Adamski's head and neck, as well as the distinctive rictus on his face, to which he apparently commented the victim looked as if he had been scared to death. Over the next 90 minutes, at least 8 other departmental officials arrived at the coal yard, including Chief Inspector Moody, a detective chief inspector, and the coroner's officer Sergeant Tetla, who was the last to join the investigation at 6:10. Neither wallet nor wristwatch were found on the body, which was searched one last time before being taken to the town of Hebden Bridge, about 3 miles to the east. The lack of personal effects could be significant, as it was, like the questionable state of the victim's clothing, emblematic of a murder, often an attempt by a guilty party to slow the process of identification. The evening continued with a careful inspection of what seemed to be a possible crime scene. Very little evidence was found, partially due to the recent heavy rain. However, Constable Agley did discover a tire imprint near the base of the coal tip, which, according to Trevor Parker, was too small for any of the vehicles normally seen at the yard. At 9:15 p.m. on June 11th, a post-mortem examination was performed at the Hebden Bridge mortuary by pathologist Dr. Alan Edwards, the findings of which were revealed during a coroner's inquest on July 3rd, held in Halifax, West Yorkshire. By the time of the inquest, the identity of the victim was known to all parties, as Leocadia Adamski had called police about her husband's disappearance on June 7th, and his subsequent entry on a missing persons list was connected to the physical description of his body. A summary of Dr. Edwards' conclusions are as follows. Zygmund Adamski had been reasonably well groomed, despite his somewhat disheveled appearance, and seemed to have been well cared for, either by himself or someone else. He showed neither outward signs of sleeplessness nor malnourishment, though stomach contents indicated he had not eaten on the day of his death. Numerous small abrasions were located on the exposed areas of his body, possibly due to contact with the coal pile, but he displayed no outward signs of great physical or neurological trauma, such as a concussion, stroke, or cerebral hemorrhage. As also indicated by the initial police investigation, Mr. Adamski had a number of small burns on the back of his skull, and a burn-like wound between 1 1/2 to 2 inches in diameter at the top of his neck. Although not an absolute determination, the injuries appeared to be caused by contact with a hot or highly corrosive liquid, sometime before he was found, possibly as much as 48 hours before. The small burns could have very well been secondary, the result of splash or overspray of some liquid. A sample of the yellowish-green greasy substance that had been applied to the larger wound was sent to a lab for analysis, but never positively identified. Nevertheless, the burns were superficial and did not appear to be instrumental in his death. As to the specific cause of death, Dr. Edwards concluded heart failure due to ischemic heart disease and emphysema. The time of death was estimated to have been between 8 and 10 hours prior to the start of the post-mortem exam, or sometime between 11:15 a.m. and 1:15 p.m. on June 11th. It was also apparent that Adamski had been exposed to a considerable amount of water for some time. This was not unexpected, as it had rained heavily before he was discovered at the coal yard, but it may also indicate his exposure occurred after his death, as a conscious individual will typically seek shelter. The inquest continued during the following month, on September 4th and 25th. Depositions during the second session included those of Zygmund's wife and a family friend named Chris. Each was presented with a series of questions, the answers to which established that Adamski had no connection to the town of Todmorden, that he had no involvement in anything criminal or unscrupulous, and that he was totally committed to the health and well-being of his wife. The final session comprised a number of family and friends of the deceased theorizing over what may have happened to him, which ultimately left Coroner James Turnbull frustrated enough to declare an open verdict. Quote, "At this stage, there is just nothing else I can do. The case is by no means closed." Unquote. Over 4 decades later, the case of Zygmund Adamski's death remains open, though no new evidence has been presented. Still, the mystery is ripe for speculation. Why did he disappear for 5 days? How did his body come to be on the top of a pile of coal over 20 miles away from his house? Several scenarios have been proposed over the years, some, unsurprisingly, more plausible than others. It has never been conclusively determined if Zygmund Adamski's death was the result of murder. Indeed, his death may have been accidental, natural, or even self-inflicted. There are reasons to believe and reasons to doubt each possibility. When later questioned by police, the Dewsbury shop owner, the last person known to have seen him alive, did recall Mr. Adamski arriving around 3:30 in the afternoon and buying a few groceries before leaving. He did not appear to be stressed or dispirited in any way. In addition, the neighbor whom greeted Mr. Adamski as he left his house recalled a brief and lighthearted exchange of words. "Are you going for a drink?" "No, it's too early." Again, this gives no indication that he was anything less than normal. Considering these statements, one could conclude Mr. Adamski's moment of misfortune, whatever it was, must have occurred on his return trip from the market, a 3 to 5 minute window of time. The event must therefore have been brief and overwhelming, leaving him unable to return to the relative safety of either the market or his house. Adamski could have had some sort of mental breakdown or minor stroke too small to be detected by Dr. Edwards during later examination. This could have resulted in the sudden onset of amnesia. He may have then simply wandered off in a state of confusion. If this was the case, the overwhelming likelihood is he then encountered and was assisted by a passing Good Samaritan, as he almost certainly was not alone for the entire 5 days he went missing. When found on the 11th, his body was reasonably well groomed and physically sound, except for a relatively minor burn. A man without complete control of his mental faculties and possibly suffering some form of memory loss would not likely be able to get by without at least drawing some attention. How would he obtain spending money? How would he eat? Where would he sleep and shave and relieve himself? If he was helped by someone, it should have been obvious to them that he wasn't in his right mind. A hypothetical do-gooder would keep him comfortable and fed, no doubt, but as a confused Polish coal miner isn't exactly a lost puppy, they would also likely take him to a hospital, or at the very least contact local authorities. Yet there are no records of such contact. Perhaps Mr. Adamski wandered for some time before he was taken in by someone, traveling down one of the myriad roads and lanes in the area toward the town of Todmorden, a place he had probably never been before and a place where he would have little chance of being recognized. If he were wandering alone for a day or two, he could have obtained shelter and then wandered off a second time before authorities were contacted. Mr. Adamski was an adult, and he was free to move about on his own. For untrained people, intermittent mental illnesses are often not readily identifiable. A Samaritan may have written off the whole incident as a man in temporary need, having left after obtaining necessary relief. This may explain his ultimate location and the odd manner of dress he was in at the time of discovery. He may not have been cognizant enough to dress properly. He may have stumbled up to and onto the pile of coal, seeking out something with which he was intimately familiar. Still, this doesn't explain how Adamski received his burn, nor does it explain how, even after the case became public knowledge and even sensationalized in national media, why no one came forward to say they helped a man fitting his description. It was no secret Adamski's life had been less than idyllic for some time, and the continuing stress may have been more than he could bear. Adamski had a diagnosed heart condition, specifically a narrowing of the coronary arteries, and suffered from chronic bronchitis, both of which left him continuously exhausted. His wife Leocadia suffered from multiple sclerosis and was bound to a wheelchair, Zygmunt her primary lifeline to the world outside their modest home. Also, a request for early retirement made by Adamski in early 1980 had recently been denied by the coal board. This was particularly disheartening because the mine at which he was employed was due to close in 1981. In a tragic and ironic twist, the coal board ultimately reversed their decision, stating so in an official letter, which arrived several days after his body was found. Mr. Adamski was human after all, and could be as prone to selfish motivations as anyone, given the right situation, his cheerful disposition unable to mask a growing resentment toward his circumstances. It is not unheard of for people to abandon their families at the drop of a hat. It is entirely possible the stress of continuous poor health, sketchy retirement, and looming responsibilities toward his disabled wife were enough for him to seek proverbial green pastures elsewhere. However, one cannot ignore the plain fact that neither his cousin Laska nor his own wife indicated any negative emotional state in either his interactions or demeanor. Specifically, on June 7th, the Saturday immediately following his disappearance, Adamski had been due to give away his goddaughter Stephanie at her wedding. He had very much been looking forward to the occasion and had openly stated so for some time. For him to simply run off on a whim, then, seems wildly out of character. People do behave in seemingly strange, unexpected ways that would have devastating effects on themselves and those around them. For example, in 2010, Dallas resident Michael Burnside was found shot dead in his home. His fiancée, Olivia Lord, was the only other person in the home at the time and was immediately suspected by police of pulling the trigger. Known to friends and family as someone who was both energetic and optimistic, he had no history of depression, was in good health, and had made long-term plans, including a house remodel and marriage. Ms. Lord suffered intense police interrogation, even being openly accused of and arrested for murder. However, further investigation revealed that Burnside had been drinking heavily on the day of his death, had been known to be reckless with firearms, and to have had several substantial debts, not the least of which was a $50,000 bill to the Internal Revenue Service for back taxes. Eventually, due to circumstantial and environmental evidence, it was determined beyond a reasonable doubt that the victim had indeed shot himself, either deliberately or accidentally. Michael Burnside's motive, forever a mystery. Could this have been the case with Zygmund Adamski? Contextually, this seems doubtful. Michael Burnside, as with many troubled individuals, maintained a shallow yet fragile veneer of positivity. Some investigation was needed to uncover the underlying problems that plagued him. Mr. Adamski's problems, though substantial, were all out in the open and had been with him for some time. It is more likely he would have adapted to these problems than have reacted. Besides, if he had intended to abandon his wife, why would he bother getting groceries first? Why would he leave on foot and not take his automobile? And in any case, why would he stay so close to home? 5 days was enough time to travel anywhere in the world. When considering a voluntary uprooting, one pertinent line of inquiry concerns the time and method by which Adamski arrived at the coal yard. Could he have walked to the yard? While 20 miles is a considerable distance on foot, when broken up over the course of 4 or 5 days, it is completely plausible for an adult man who is reasonably ambulatory to accomplish this task and still have time and energy to find lodging each evening. Why Adamski would have made the journey all the way to Todmorden on foot is another matter altogether. But even if the coal yard was nothing more than a random endpoint, the idea that not one person would ever report seeing him during the trip, even after his death became public knowledge, is hard to believe. By walking, he would be highly visible for at least 2 to 3 hours each day, as well as interacting with anyone along the way. In 1980, the Tomlins coal yard abutted a working train station. The station and accompanying rail line are still in use as of the publication of this video. It is conceivable Adamski rode a train to the Todmorden station and disembarked. Depending on where he boarded, this could have been accomplished in as little as an hour. This would account for a lack of witnesses and allow him plenty of time to see to his own well-being. During the early 1980s, the eastbound Manchester to Leeds train arrived at the Todmorden station every 26 minutes after the hour. The westbound returning train arrived at the opposite platform 10 minutes later. Trevor Parker had found the body of Mr. Adamski at 3:45 p.m. on June 11th and was adamant that there had been no body on the coal at 8:15 a.m. This would suggest, assuming all trains were on schedule for the day, Adamski arrived sometime between 8:26 a.m. and 3:36 p.m. However, during subsequent investigation, police discovered a local man named Peter Sutcliffe, who was a part-time worker at the coal yard, had stopped by the yard sometime between 1 and 1:30 p.m. to discuss some business with Mr. Parker. Finding him absent, Sutcliffe left shortly after he arrived. Like Parker, Sutcliffe was quite positive that nobody was on the coal tip, and Zygmund Adamski was not present at the site. Even if we are generous, Sutcliffe's estimation vastly narrows the investigative window of time. Adamski's body could have only appeared on the coal within a 2.5-hour period, between just after 1 p.m. and just before 3:45 p.m. The post-mortem examination performed by Dr. Edwards concluded that Adamski's death occurred between 8 and 10 hours prior to said examination. This would place time of death at 11:15 a.m. to 1:15 p.m., strongly suggesting that Adamski had died before arriving at the Tomlins coal yard. It had been suggested at the time that Adamski had in fact arrived at the coal yard in the back of a truck and had been dumped in place. It was even speculated that he may have jumped into the bed of a coal truck as it passed beneath a motorway overpass. Theories such as these, or variations thereof, are not very tenable, as Trevor Parker indicated that no delivery trucks had arrived on either June 11th or several days prior. Besides sudden medical issues or an uncharacteristic change of heart, it is conceivable Mr. Adamski was taken hostage by someone with ill intentions. An individual or group of individuals may have driven up to Mr. Adamski as he traveled back home from the market and forcibly abducted him. The Adamski residence was near three major roads, the M62, the A653, and the A650. All of these roads are well traveled and have direct access to the town of Tingley. Would-be kidnappers could have made a hasty escape within minutes, whisking away their victim to the Todmorden area or anywhere else in northern England before anyone in the Adamski household grew overly concerned. This would be an even more plausible turn of events if Adamski knew his would-be abductor. He may have stopped to talk and been forced into a vehicle during a moment of inattention, or he could have willingly gotten into a vehicle through false pretense. This theory is partially bolstered by both statements made to the media by Leocadia soon after her husband's disappearance, and by information uncovered by investigators David Sankey and John Hansen. Quote, Mr. Adamski had fallen out with an immediate male family member whose wife, being a friend of Mrs. Adamski, had allegedly sought sanctuary with them following an injunction being taken out by her against him for the risk of further harassment and intimidation. Unquote. Domestic disputes will often pull individuals with little involvement into a spiraling orbit. A relative might seek revenge on the Adamskis if they viewed them as interferences with their own life and well-being. If an abusive man was issued an injunction, he might view this as a grave injustice and do whatever he could to seek revenge. Although Sankey and Hansen imply the family member in question was known to the police and had even had a brief interview regarding the Adamski disappearance, one can only assume official investigations into the matter had eliminated the person from the list of potential suspects. One somewhat creative theory held that KGB agents might have absconded with the man in an attempt to squash any unauthorized relations between Poland, then a member of the Soviet bloc, and NATO. Although these organizations held no special affinity for one another, the amount of resources necessary to find, track, capture, and execute a sickly coal miner seems a bit disproportionate to the result. Of course, any kidnapping could have been purely a crime of opportunity. Mr. Adamski may have literally been at the wrong place at the wrong time. When found on the coal tip, Adamski's body was not in a particularly bad physical state, aside from being dead, of course. One might describe his appearance as that of a mid-50s man enjoying a lazy morning, hair messy, chin unshaven, and not yet having eaten breakfast. Wherever he was during the 5 days he was missing, he was being kept healthy and reasonably comfortable. This could indicate an intent for him to be ransomed by his captors, though this isn't really borne out by successive events. No one was ever given a ransom demand, nor issued any sort of threat. That said, a demand may have been forthcoming, and Adamski may have escaped before it could be issued. Perhaps whomever he had escaped from thought it better to let the man stumble around the countryside than try to find him and be caught in the act. Adamski was not in the best of health, and it was reasonable to assume he wouldn't last long on his own. Here again we encounter the possibility of said kidnapping being a random act. If there wasn't any obvious connection between Adamski and his kidnappers, they likely would have avoided drawing attention to themselves. Assuming Mr. Adamski was victim of a kidnapping, which seems the most probable scenario, perhaps motives and means can be gleaned from other details in the case. What could have caused the burns on his head and neck? The medical examiner believed that the cause was either made by something hot or corrosive, possibly a liquid, which could indicate either a chemical or thermal burn. Since the burns are not life-threatening and not located on his face, one could rule out the use of acids as a tool of a botched disfigurement or murder. Indeed, the application of ointment would suggest the burns were received accidentally, as a would-be tormentor would not likely offer first aid. Since the exact nature of the burn was never identified, all anyone can do is speculate. Innumerable activities involve the use of caustic chemicals, and there is no reason to conclude that Mr. Adamski was doing those activities himself. He could have simply been in the way when whoever it was splashed the unknown substance through the air. Dr. Edwards did conclude that the burns could have been sustained as much as 2 days before he was found. One wonders if held hostage, Mr. Adamski had tried to escape and been injured in the attempt. Perhaps medication was applied to the affected area because physical injury was not the point of the hostage-taking endeavor. It is also possible the burns were received through Mr. Adamski's voluntary actions. Being in generally poor health, he may have sought alternative treatments for relief of pain or fatigue. One practice common to 1980 as well as today is known as hot cupping therapy. A compact heat source of some type, often a small cotton ball lit via match, is placed beneath a glass or ceramic cup. The resulting vacuum created within the cup draws the skin upward, breaking blood vessels in the affected area, much like a hickey given by a teenage Romeo. Whether or not this therapy is useful medically is debatable, but hot cupping is used for everything from back and head pain to chronic fatigue and muscle repair. Burns are not uncommon during such treatments, for which Mr. Adamski would have been a prime candidate. The nature of the unknown substance covering the burn has often been cause for speculation in the case, but there is likely no justification for this. Laboratory analysis may have only gone as far as comparing the substance to others on file. If the substance was in fact a burn ointment originating from a foreign manufacturer or a bohemian homebrew, which is very possible if used during a non-conventional medical treatment, it is very likely a lab wouldn't have been able to identify it. During the initial police examination, Mr. Adamski was noted as being on his back, but according to the investigators John Hansen and David Sankey, a photograph taken before the medical examination indicated a large amount of residue on his face, which would be easily explained if he had been found by the ambulance crew in a face-down position and then flipped over before PCs Godfrey and Agley arrived. This possibility is also supported by Trevor Parker, who recalled seeing the body initially face down. This seemingly insignificant detail could provide a clue to how Adamski reached his final resting place. If an adult man climbed a sizable pile of coal under his own power, he would be doing so with his face toward the coal. If the same man were carried and then heaved upon a similar pile by one or two other individuals, he would likely have landed on his back. During the months following Adamski's death, one of the strangest theories put forth, even by those in national media, such as Sunday Mirror journalists John Sheard and Stuart Bonney in the wildly titled article Amazing UFO Death Riddle, was that Zygmund Adamski had been victim of a UFO abduction gone bad. At the inquest on the death of Zygmund Adamski, coroner James Turnbull stated, quote, "This is quite the most mysterious death I have ever investigated. As a coroner, I cannot speculate. But I must admit that if I were walking over Ilkley Moor tomorrow and a UFO came down, I would not be surprised. I might be terrified, but not surprised." Unquote. Obviously, Coroner Turnbull was not being literal as to the involvement of extraterrestrials and merely illustrating the bizarre nature of the mystery with another equally bizarre hypothetical event. This, however, did not stop the overly credulous from ignoring known facts and using his remarks to bolster their claims. Mr. Adamski was found in a bizarre physical state. It is very difficult to explain how a man in poor health managed to perform the almost Herculean feat of climbing to the top of a large, greasy mound of coal, although that climb may have in fact contributed to his death. If he was attempting to take stock of his location and raise his vantage point, the coal tip was an obviously poor choice, as it was located at the end of a series of bunkers, surrounded by other structures and difficult to climb. Indeed, he would have been far better off to wander around until he found someone to help. But climbing a mound of coal is not the only way to reach the top. One could also be deposited from above, by something like a crane, helicopter, balloon, or even UFO, as some have interpreted Mr. Turnbull's comments. Did the crew of a UFO swoop out of the sky, land, disembark, and forcibly kidnap Mr. Adamski as he was walking down the street? No witnesses have ever come forward to report anything unusual, which is extremely unlikely considering Adamski's residence is in a well-populated region, near several well-traveled highways. None of the residential streets nor locations Mr. Adamski visited are isolated. He would have no opportunity to slip down an alleyway or an out-of-the-way alcove. Of course, one could speculate that a UFO may have passed over the area at an altitude high enough to avoid ground observation and then somehow teleported Mr. Adamski into itself. While not inconceivable given the possibility of technology far in advance of our own, this type of speculation amounts to explaining one baffling enigma by using another. Did the operators of said UFO feed and groom Mr. Adamski for 5 days? And considering where his body ultimately landed, why would a UFO drop him 20 miles from his house? Either UFO occupants would care about Mr. Adamski's well-being or they would not. If they did care, which could be argued as he was not malnourished, why not return him alive to the location they found him? If Mr. Adamski's well-being was not a high priority, which could also be argued since he died presumably within custody, why not set him down 200 miles away, or 2,000? Certainly the latter would be very difficult to explain from a prosaic standpoint. Staunch proponents of the UFO death hypothesis will often point out that, considering the complexities and vastness of the universe, it is not impossible for an extraterrestrial craft to be responsible. While this is indeed true, one should not confuse possible with probable. The law of parsimony, often called Occam's razor, lends credence to the explanation with the fewest number of assumptions, and although not a law in the true scientific sense, the principle is useful in guiding one toward objective reality more often than not. Why then would such a seemingly illogical explanation carry such weight? Ideas, even those outside of mainstream thinking, are rarely formed in a vacuum and will often find fertile ground in fields of high strangeness, of which the ultimate state of Zygmund Adamski's body was inarguably one. Blatant sensationalism aside, there are three main reasons why UFOs and Zygmund Adamski have been indelibly linked. Some authentic, high-profile UFO cases exhibited similar details, a false connection implied by the Adamski surname, and a number of contemporary UFO sightings or encounters in the region. In November of 1975, forestry worker Travis Walton had supposedly encountered and had been taken aboard a UFO while in the Arizona wilderness. Like Adamski, he had been missing for just over 5 days and then reappeared, unlike Adamski, very much alive, several miles from his home. Due to local and eventually national media coverage, the Walton case became world famous, perhaps only second to that of Betty and Barney Hill. That notoriety, coupled with the several-day absence of the man in question, an admittedly intriguing coincidence, undoubtedly accounts for some of the Adamski legend. In October of 1978, 20-year-old Frederick Valentich was piloting his Cessna 182 Skylane over Bass Strait, a large expanse of ocean between mainland Australia and the island of Tasmania. Just after 7 p.m., Valentich reported an unidentified aircraft was following him. After a few tense moments of communication with Melbourne Air Traffic Control, he transmitted the chilling statement of, "It's not an aircraft," and was never seen or heard from again. The implication is, of course, Valentich was snatched out of the air or possibly destroyed by a UFO of some kind. The story was widely publicized and primed many to assume the worst from strange objects seen in the sky. In November of 1979, another forestry worker named Robert Taylor encountered what he claimed was a strange, hemispherical-shaped object hovering in a woodland clearing beside a pair of smaller, spherical objects that resembled horned naval mines. The mines rolled toward him, somehow grappled his legs, and proceeded to drag him toward the larger object, at which point he lost consciousness. He later awoke to find the clearing empty and himself exhausted. A sizable and noteworthy police investigation was launched into the affair, which was treated as an assault, and a great deal of focus was placed on forensics, which, although did not prove the veracity of Mr. Taylor's story, did uncover evidence such as multiple lacerations on the man's legs, a notable feature of the Adamski case. The story gained national attention and cemented the idea of the UFO attack in the minds of many in the press and public, an idea still ripe for picking only a few months later. The first half of the 1950s was a wild west of UFO celebrity, a decade situated between the famous sighting over Mount Rainier by Kenneth Arnold that sparked the modern era of UFO investigation and the space age ushered in by Sputnik 1. During this era, dozens of individuals claimed a regular face-to-face communication with extraterrestrials, usually in remote locations and often far away from witnesses, regaling audiences with tales of benevolent space brothers and the wisdom they imparted from the loading ramps of their interstellar saucers. Collectively known as contactees, these men and women were responsible for most of the public understanding of the UFO phenomena, at least until United States Air Force research initiatives such as Projects Sign and Blue Book became more commonly known. By far the most popular of these contactees was a California man named George Adamski, a man with no relation to the future ill-fated Zygmunt. Adamski is a relatively common name in Poland, where both men originated. George Adamski's written accounts of his adventures include jaunts around the solar system and long-winded conversations with a Venusian named Orthon, a Martian named Furcon, and a being from Saturn named Ramu. Supposedly, besides his contact with UFO occupants, George Adamski held court with various earthly luminaries, including Queen Juliana of Holland, Pope John XXIII, and President John F. Kennedy, the reality of which is somewhat dubious. Though largely forgotten in the 21st century, in 1980, the year of Zygmund Adamski's demise, George Adamski was still the proverbial poster boy of the early days of UFO contact. The initial association made between the two men and their last names is an all-too-human reaction when faced with something out of the norm. The association has simply continued into the ensuing decades, despite its obviously erroneous nature. During the mid to late 1970s, the British Isles had been experiencing something of a UFO sighting wave. In her book The Pennine UFO Mystery, researcher Jenny Randall's notes in the days between Zygmund Adamski's disappearance and reappearance, a number of unexplained balls of orange light were reported near Bradford, Halifax, and even Todmorden, of all places. Many of these sightings were shown to have been caused by helicopters using searchlights during maintenance of local power lines, but this was only widely publicized sometime after the fact, undoubtedly leaving a UFO mystery to fester in the public consciousness. Curiously, one particular observation in Todmorden occurred just before midnight on June 10, 1980, within a mile from the Tomlins coal yard. A husband and wife had heard a strange sound outside their home similar to rushing water. They went outside to investigate and observed an elliptical light above their roof, pulsating between red and green, that then rose vertically until it disappeared from sight. Perhaps the most influential event occurred only a few months after the discovery of Mr. Adamski's body. In late November of 1980, Police Constable Godfrey, one of the responding officers to the Tomlins coal yard, had a notable encounter with a strange hovering object while on an early morning patrol. As with the earlier sighting by the Todmorden couple, this encounter was geographically very close to the location of Adamski's body, included a very detailed description of physical interaction between the object and the environment given by a reliable observer, and culminated with the Constable Godfrey experiencing a very strange period of missing time. Although there is no objective reason to believe the Adamski case and Godfrey case are linked, the fact that Constable Godfrey was intimately involved with both seems more than a fluke at first glance. Whether or not any of the UFO sightings before or after the death of Zygmund Adamski were genuinely explainable is not at issue. Some or all of them could very well be objectively real events. An expectation was created through these sightings, likely persuading many of those who would normally have only a passing interest in the Adamski affair to have a less critical mindset. A prosaic solution is not necessarily a simple one. Because we can say with confidence that Martian malfeasance wasn't responsible for Mr. Adamski's death, we cannot then conclude that a real mystery does not exist. There is a distinct possibility that a heinous act had been perpetrated, be it kidnapping, murder, or both. The fact is, what amounts to an unsolved crime and a legitimate mystery has, due to sensationalism and intellectual dishonesty, been co-opted by some to lend credence to a fringe theory and dismissed by others as completely mundane and not worthy of their time. Whatever the ultimate answer, we should remember Zygmund Adamski for the individual he was, a good and honorable man who met a tragic, undeserved, and most likely very earthly end.